Thank you, Heather. Allow me to introduce you to my face. I have to say, I've been in a number of places since we got into this great mess, and I have never seen an audience as fully masked as this one. So congratulations for your good citizenship. As Heather said, I'm going to spend a little time talking about the history of our New England stone walls. I'm going to say a few things about how they are made and how their styles emerged and changed over time. I'm going to try to take you up to the contemporary days of building because, as I'll mention, we are in a bit of a stone wall renaissance right now where quite a few people have gotten into the business of making them who were not present in that business before. And I'm going to do all of this as quickly as I possibly can because that will get me to the part of the program that I always enjoy the most, and that is answering any questions that you have. And Heather gave you a very good introduction to that. But I will simply add that I'm going to flip through a lot of this material as quickly as I can. So if I speed through something a little too fast and don't give enough detail, please don't hesitate to take me back to anything that's piqued your interest or that you'd like to hear a little bit more elaboration about. I'm going to begin with two only tangentially related subjects, however. One of them is a public service announcement, and the other one is a disclaimer. The public service announcement is this: I am not looking for work. The disclaimer is this: if you happen to be sitting in a place where you can't really see what I am doing on this tabletop while I speak to you, please don't worry about it. It's got nothing at all to do with what I'm talking about. Just trying to keep my hands busy. I'm going to begin with a particular year, a very important year in the history of New England stone wall building, as it turns out. That year was 1871. In 1871, our beloved U.S. Department of Agriculture decided that it would be a great idea to take inventory of all the fencing in the United States. And so, I know. So they worked on this terribly important project for about a year, and then produced a huge report full of many facts. Among them was this one: that in the 6 New England states and the state of New York combined, in other words, the northeast corner of the United States, there were more than 250,000 miles of stone wall. 250,000 miles. That is more stone wall than there is railroad track in this country. It's more stone wall than the entire length of the U.S. coastline. It is enough stone wall to go all the way around the world 10 times. It's even enough, this is the last statistic, it's even enough to stretch from the parking lot outside this gorgeous old hall to the surface of the moon. There are two notable things about this number. The first one is that it is wrong. It's too low by a long, long way. And that is because the Federal Report on Fencing only concerned itself with what it said it concerned itself with, which was fences or barriers between sections of farmland. Whereas anybody who has been in New England for more than approximately 15 minutes knows that there are a great many more things here in New England built out of what we call dry-laid stone, that is to say, stone structures that are held together by nothing more than their own weight and the skill of the person who puts them there. Many more things built this way than merely fencing. They include causeways, ramps, stone-lined wells, the old town pounds, and of course, thousands and thousands of foundations under houses, barns, buildings of all kinds. Taken together with a straightforward 250,000 plus miles of dry-laid fencing, it's been estimated by some people who became perhaps a little giddy at this huge number that there is more dry-laid stone in the northeastern United States than there is in the entire rest of the world combined. This is not an assertion I am personally prepared to back up. But I will say that just the fact that somebody made this observation should give you some idea of the almost incredible communal architectural accomplishment that these walls and other structures represent. Second notable thing about this 250,000 mile number really doesn't have anything to do with the number itself, but rather with the year that it was arrived at. Because if you could pick a year in which we reached a kind of tipping point here in the Northeast and began to lose more stone wall than we were gaining, you could do much worse than fetch up on 1871. By that time, a kind of confluence, if you will, of events that had been developing throughout the 19th century came to a head and began to put an end to that long era of dry-laid stone wall building in which virtually everyone on a small New England farm was engaged at some point during the year in gathering, moving, or assembling stone into coherent structures of one kind or another, or simply engaged in getting rid of it insofar as they were able to do that. The end of our constant attention to the building of dry-laid fencing came about for many reasons. One, of course, was the Civil War, which took all kinds of farmers off their land and sent them off to fight. Many of them did not return. The Industrial Revolution had a great deal to do with it as it began to replace ordinary farm work for a great many young Americans with factory work in places like Lowell and Manchester, New Hampshire. The death of the sheep industry, which had been such a mainstay for New England farmers in the decades prior to the Civil War, also had a great deal to do with the abandonment of unproductive farmland that ensued even before, or began to ensue even before the Civil War. But now, in the aftermath of the Civil War, began to result in enormous outmigration from many parts of New England, especially higher elevation places, where the land played out much, much sooner than anyone expected that it would. But perhaps the most profound effect that the 19th century had on stone wall building was in its mechanization of agriculture. And this bears a little bit of talking about. The model that was brought here by New England farmers when they first began to appear in the early part of the 17th century was a model that held that small fields produced best. This was essentially the medieval way of going about making coherent farmland. The reason for this was that all work was done by hand. And so if you were mowing or plowing or doing any other kind of chore on the surface of the ground, you had a reasonable chance of finishing that task in a decent day's work if your acreage was broken up into sections of 2 to 3 to 5 acres, something like that. However, by the latter part of the 19th century, a great many farmers were beginning to switch their emphasis for labor over from handwork to machinery. Now, for instance, if you are mowing hay on a tidy little 3-acre piece or so, you can step right up to the edges of the fence that is binding in that field. If it's an old stone wall, you can literally cut every blade of grass right up to the wall. But many farmers were no longer cutting their hay that way toward the end of the 19th century. Instead, they were dragging a 6 or an 8-foot cutter bar behind a team of horses or oxen. Well, when you're dragging a cutter bar or any other kind of machinery, you've got to start turning about 20 feet before every corner in order to get the machine and the team around. And that meant that there were now 4 useless triangles of land in every single one of these tidy little medieval-style fields. Well, useless acreage is not a popular item among frugal New England farmers, and so toward the end of the century, a great many of them found themselves digging large trenches beside old stone walls that in many cases had been built by their own fathers, grandfathers, or even partially by themselves, dumping the walls into them and burying them just below the surface of the ground in order to enlarge their fields and make them more economically responsive to the new realities of farming. This situation was not helped in the least by the invention of barbed wire in 1868, right before the time when this federal report on fencing was compiled. One of the interesting things about New England stone walls today, especially the older ones, is that when you are perambulating through the woods and you run across a strand or two of old rusty barbed wire beside an ancient stone wall or the remnants of that stone wall, you can be sure that on the day that wire was put up, any maintenance that that stone wall had been receiving prior to that came to an abrupt end. And so the appearance of barbed wire right around the time of this report accelerated the deterioration of many of our old stone walls, which at that point, especially on abandoned farmland, were already beginning to sink into the ground or otherwise disappear behind or underneath the reforestation of so many thousands of acres which had once been productive farmland. Well, how did we get all these stone walls in the first place? You know, it's a little surprising, I think, it certainly was to me when I first learned it, to know that what we may assume, because of the enormity of the network of stone walls we have throughout New England, that they must have been put up laboriously over many, many generations of hard labor. But in fact, in historical terms, we acquired our stone walls in a remarkably short period of time. One estimate holds that the bulk of them, on a volume basis anyway, was constructed in a mere 50-year period between about 1775 and 1825. Now, this does not mean that no stone walls were built before this. We have reports of stone walls being constructed as early as 1607 in the failed colony up in Sagadahoc, Maine. And certainly there are plenty of verified reports of stone walls being built as early as the 1630s and 40s, especially down on the southern coast of Rhode Island and in other places where access to the land did not require crashing your way through the wilderness. I noted when I came in this morning that, for instance, that the date of incorporation here in Lancaster is in the 17th century. It's more than 100 years before the incorporation of my own town of Hopkinton, New Hampshire. It took a while to get to inland places, and so the earliest agricultural work, and hence the earliest stone walls, tends to be found in the coastal areas of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and that's why some of the, if not most of the really old stone walls here in New England are in those areas. Now, the one other very important reason why we acquired our network of stone walls so quickly is a kind of ironic one, because the fact is that when these farmers began to break their land out and try to turn it into coherent farmland, their first choice of fencing wasn't stone. It was the huge mess that you get when you have to cut down thousands of acres of virgin timber. And so the earliest fences, agricultural fences here in New England, were made of split rails and pulled stumps set up in great forbidding rows, simply as primitive and impassable barriers. At the same time that they were involved in these rough and ready days of settlement, however, these farmers were discovering what all of you know quite well, which is that we live in a remarkably stony part of the country. And so, in addition to cutting down all that timber and cleaning up the mess that ensued from that, they found themselves obligated to move enormous amounts of surface stone off the land. They tended to take this out to the edges of the fields they were creating and simply throw it up against the organic barriers that they'd been putting together, the stumps and the split rails. However, as their clearing became more and more complete and the old New England agricultural landscape, which looked a lot like the way certain parts of England look now, began to take shape, they began simply to reorganize that stone that they had collected up against their earliest fences. And given the fact that the material to make those fences became more and more scarce as they began to achieve the cleared out forest-less, treeless spaces that farming requires, their supply of the materials for stump and split rail fences, of course, declined precipitously, and so they simply began to reorganize some of those long, low mounds of stone that they'd pulled out of and off the surface of their fields in order to become more durable and more consistent fencing. That meant, of course, that an enormous amount of the material they needed to create the stone walls in the first place was already lying along the fence lines when they began to get serious about putting them together as walls. This, as you might imagine, vastly speeded up the process of creating our enormous network. This enormous concentration on switching over the entire fencing scheme of the place really began to take off in the aftermath of the Revolution. Once we were no longer concerned with fighting a war on our own soil, it was a little bit easier to focus on the infrastructure needs of creating a farming landscape. But that was not the only thing that happened. Early in the 19th century, an event occurred which vastly accelerated the building of stone walls here in New England, and that was the arrival of the first merino sheep in our part of the country. These sheep were such an instant success after about 1811 or so that they became the primary animal for a great many New England farmers. Well, sheep are wanderers, and they must be contained, and so in addition to all the other needs that these farmers had for fencing, they also now found themselves obligated to enclose many, many thousands of acres in new stone walls in order to pasture these money-making sheep that they had acquired. That meant that after the first decade of the 19th century or so, the acceleration of stone wall building literally guaranteed that we would end up with a huge network of stone walls. And this is not only the time when we begin to see the craft professionalized to some extent. Specialists began to appear, the same as with timber framing or slaughtering or other chores in which folks tended to create a specialty for themselves in any given neighborhood. That happened with stone wall building too. And so, until the sheep industry began to run out of gas, the enormous effort that was put into creating enclosed pastures for them extended into the hilly areas in places where the soil wasn't much good, but pasturage for sheep was quite good indeed. It was that spell that saw us begin to really cover the ground with stonework in all kinds of parts of New England. And you know, when you walk through the woods now, you're going to see old walls that are running up hills too steep to stand on. They come back down the other sides of mountains and jump through swamps and run across streams or under culverts. They seem to be virtually everywhere. Most of these walls, especially in outlying or hilly areas, we have the sheep industry to thank for. Well, the sheep industry, however, although it did give New England the only sustained period of agricultural prosperity it ever knew, did not last forever. It began to fall victim to economic troubles in the late 1830s. There were bank failures and so on. Tariff problems, does that sound familiar? And after a while, the ground cropping ability of these sheep to take the turf down to almost nothing in any given place had a terrible effect, especially in higher elevation places where the soil was never very thick to begin with. And so by the 1840s or so, the sheep industry was beginning to totter a little bit. It got a bit of a boost in the run-up to the Civil War because of the need for uniforms, but then broke big time at the end of that war as the industry itself began to move to places like Montana or out into the Ohio Valley where the land was better, and as transportation improvements made it possible for things to be hauled long distances in a way they never had before. This meant that New England began to slide into a kind of depression, certainly a recession that lasted many, many years, And at the same time, we began to lose enormous amounts of population. Many of these folks simply walked away from their farms and let them go. And that meant that post-Civil War, thousands and thousands of acres which had formerly been enclosed by stone walls were now abandoned, and the forest came back with enormous efficiency and enormous speed very, very quickly. To the point where when people visit us now, they often ask us, why did they build all these walls in the woods? Why did they build all these walls in the woods? When you tell them that the woods were once open fields, I have said this to visitors from other parts of the country who simply don't believe me. The walls themselves are older than the woods in many places. Well, how are these things put together? There is a kind of aphorism about building dry-laid stone walls. It's not very helpful in New England, but it's one that many people know, and that is that if you are going to put a dry-laid stone structure together and you want it to stay together for a little bit of time, because contrary to the mythology of New England stone walls, every single one of them falls down sooner or later. So when you're building one, you're building something that you hope will fall down later, not sooner. You do this by following, to some degree, the old aphorism which goes place 2, 1 over 2, or 2 over 1. This is a shorthand way of saying that identifying the basic principle of dry-laid stonework, which is to offset courses or rows of individual stones within any structure so that they are not standing in columns. In other words, with only one other stone to hold them in their position. If each row is offset over the rows that came before, then over the course of the entire structure, every stone in the wall will develop multiple physical dependencies for holding its position, not just one. This reorients weight and pressure throughout the structure so that although the wall is built of many, many thousands of individual objects, it holds itself together as though it was a kind of connected set of small objects, like chain mail, for instance, whose rings interlock with each other. This interlocking of stones within a dry-laid structure, whether it's 1 over 2 or 2 over 7 or 16 over 28, it doesn't matter what the numbers are, needs to be practiced not just in the visible part of the wall, but also throughout the structure, so that there is as little space as possible left between individual stones and that they cannot shift or move with any kind of ease. Well, why is this necessary? These are stones, right? They don't have legs. They're not trying to get away. Or are they? The fact is that every stone in the world has an ambition to sink to the center of the earth as soon as possible. It's extraordinarily patient about waiting for an opportunity to fulfill this ambition, and when it gets one, it accepts immediately. You know, we do have earthquakes here in New England. They're not very spectacular by California standards, but they're enough. A dozen years ago or so, we had one of the biggest ones we've had here for many years, a massive 4.0. Now, I know they're not spectacular by California or Tokyo standards at all. However, they're enough. Because when that little 4.0 set off, it rippled throughout New England. I live in Hopkinton, which is about 65 miles away from the town of Sanford, Maine, which was the epicenter of this particular little earthquake, and my house shook like a leaf for about a second and a half when it was rolling across the countryside. More to the point, every single stone in every wall between me and Sanford, Maine, and a whole lot of other places too, said to itself, hey, here's my chance. I can get a little closer to the center of the earth. And if there was any space around that stone within the structure that it occupied, it slipped or slid or clicked or otherwise contrived to get itself into that space. and thus to get a little closer to the ground. When it did that, it deprived one or two other stones in its immediate vicinity of some of their support. And that meant that a kind of ripple of disorganization settled through the entire wall. Earthquakes are not the only thing that does this. Erosion, expansion of tree roots, catastrophic events like floods and so forth, uneven compression of one part of the wall to another, in other words, with one part sinking in a little faster than another does. All these things set out to take stones apart and to disrupt the balance of contacts that allows them to hold each other tightly together in any given structure. And this is why stone walls are like people. They tend to loosen up and spread out as they get older. And eventually, in spite of their best efforts, to fall apart completely. This happens to every single one of them, and it's why stone walls need regular maintenance. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the sort of signature poem of New England stone wall building, which is Robert Frost's Mending Wall. What's not often remarked on about that poem is that Frost is speaking here of an annual chore, not a special event. This is the one thing that you have to do when you are trying to maintain stone walls, especially for agricultural purposes. You have to get out and give them a little touch-up, a little maintenance on a fairly regular basis in order to arrest that constant tendency to loosen up, to spread out, and to lose its structural integrity. Well, the death of stone wall building in terms of the farmers giving up on using it as their primary means of fencing looked as though it was going to fairly well eliminate the craft from practice here in the country. That is not what happened, however, and that is partly because in the middle of the 19th century we began to experience not just the out-migration of old farmers to other parts of the country, but also the in-migration of an enormous number of folks from European countries where stone wall building was a recognized profession. I'm talking now about countries like Ireland, like Italy, Finland, Greece, several others. And these new workers who came flooding in the years after the Irish potato famine and then on into the 20th century through Ellis Island and other ports of entry, many of them were skilled stone workers. Some even brought here in order to practice their craft here. And they found work. It just wasn't for the farmers. It was for municipalities putting up stonework around reservoirs, cemeteries, things like that, other public places. It was for the railroads, which were in the midst of their developmental phase of snaking out over the entire country and needed all kinds of stonework in the form of infrastructure for culvert headers, bridge abutments, and so forth. And they went to work for the wealthy, who in many cases were beginning to buy up some of the old New England abandoned farms and turn them into summer estates. And you can still see the contrast, and it's quite fascinating, between the work that they began to do here and the older, rougher agricultural work that had come before. It shows up in places like Castle in the Clouds up in Moultonborough, New Hampshire, where you can see the work of the original farmer settlers alongside the work of the Italian crews who came in at the behest of the owner of that property in the late 19th, early 20th century and put up a whole bunch of other stuff. Sometimes walls or fences, sometimes portal pillars at the bottoms of the driveways. You can still see some of these pillars standing in sort of ruined glory. If you drive up Route 28, for instance, into Wolfboro, New Hampshire, which has been a summer resort since the middle of the 19th century, and had quite a few of these rehabbed old farms in it with very nice stonework contributed by immigrant builders of the late 19th and early 20th century. Their presence here and the kind of work that they did resulted in two very important changes for our purpose. First of all, it changed the style of stone walls. The style had already been reconsidered, reorganizing itself, even from the early days of the 19th century, because stone walls became such a marker of the New England landscape so quickly that they began to function as a kind of sign of who was a good farmer and who was not. It was one way of judging how a particular farm was being taken care of by looking at the quality or the condition of the stone walls on it. This, of course, once it became obvious to the farmers themselves, they began to respond to it. And so stone walls began to become a little tighter, a little fancier, a little more interested in showing off than in merely doing their jobs. And so even as early as the 1830s, with the coming of the Greek revival in architecture, you began to see the ways that stone walls are built and how people think about them beginning to alter itself. This was changed fairly radically yet again in the hands of the skillful immigrant builders of the late 19th and early 20th century, as they began to build not with the notion, which had been central to the New England farmer attitudes toward stone wall building, that you were building for structure only. And now it began to take on a kind of symbolic value. The Greek revival itself, in terms of architecture, was also very much driven by symbolic value. And it replaced an older, much more intuitive way of looking at buildings. This is exactly the same thing that happened with farmer infrastructure, too. We adopted the Greek revival because we conceived of our democracy as having been inspired by events and attitudes in ancient Greece and Rome, and that is why, for instance, George Washington was once depicted in a toga, or why we decided that it would be a good idea to add columns and pediments and other features of Greek and Roman temples to our public buildings. It's also the time when we chose the color white as a kind of symbolic political color, if you will, and began to paint all our villages and many of our public buildings that color, even though in days prior to that, all of the old buildings displayed a fairly motley array of all kinds of different colors. But the second thing that the immigrant stonework builders did that probably had even more of a profound effect on the way things are with stone wall work today was that they tended to become the teachers of the generations in the early part of the 20th century who taught people like me. I learned how to do this from my uncle, who was a farmer, not a mason. But he learned from a Brit and from a French-Canadian man who came down to live here from Quebec and be a stone wall builder in New Hampshire. These folks, although they were much fewer in number than the farmers who had produced the giant network in the first place, made it possible for subsequent generations not to lose this craft. And once we entered the residential housing boom of the late 70s, early 80s, a boom which has stayed with us with some ups and downs ever since, a demand for landscape services became far more active than it had been before. I'm sure you've noticed that every other truck that goes down the road nowadays belongs to some kind of landscape company. Many of these folks, because of demand for hardscape services such as decorative garden walls, steps, retainers, that sort of thing, have put on their crews or made it possible for members of those crews to learn this craft. And the fact is there are many more people building or learning this trade than were active in it, have been active in it for at least the last 100 years, if not more. We are in no danger whatsoever of losing this craft at the present time. Well, just very briefly, there's a distinction between walls that get built here in New England and stone wall work in other parts of the world. That has to do with two things. One is the stone itself, and the other one is the motivation of the builders. In most parts of the world where dry laid stone is very common, and it is in virtually every place where there's lots and lots of stone. The available stone supply is fairly homogeneous with respect to its array of shapes and sizes. In other words, if you're in the Lake District of England, or even in parts of this country, say the Kentucky, Virginia, Tennessee triangle, which is a great hotbed of wonderful dry-laid stonework. The stone in the Lake District of England tends to be broken and flattish, not terribly large, and certainly not rounded and worn, as it is here in so many places in New England. Down in the Piedmont region, it tends to be limestone outcropping, which breaks away in rough but serviceable squares and rectangles from the outcrops that it's cut from. But here in New England, we have no such agreeable situation. Instead, we have a gigantic mess of everything from a ping pong ball to a Volkswagen bus, all smashed up and mixed up in an incomprehensible jumble. And so the working in New England stone in the world of stone wall building that's international is known as a fool's errand, or an almost impossible task. So much of our stone simply doesn't want to grip onto other stone, doesn't want to play nice with others. It's difficult to form into sound structures, and so it required a certain amount of adjustment on the part of these builders in order to make it fit into things. Because of that, we tended to overbuild here. In other words, to make walls much larger than they actually needed to be, only to offer enough interior space within those structures to handle all the terrible misshapen trapezoids and round cannonballs and all that kind of stuff that dry-laid wall builders hate to see because they are so difficult to lay into coherent structures. So there was a difference in the stone. There's also a difference in the motivation of the builders. In most parts of the world where they build lots of dry-laid work, they do it because they need a wall. We did it for that reason here in New England too, but we also did it because we needed to get rid of as much stone as possible. And so an awful lot of what we have built all around the countryside is built at least partially for that purpose. And that is why we see often in sections between fields, for instance, in between field walls that run to 10 to 15 to 20 feet wide, far, far larger than they need to be to do whatever job was assigned to them when they were first constructed. These are containment walls. They're there not just to be the barrier between particular sections of field, but also to contain as much stone as can be thrown in there. In fact, one of the more improvisational techniques that our forebears used to create these walls was not to carefully lay together anything in terms of a coherent structure, but simply to set up two parallel lines of very large stones, tight packed right up against each other to create a kind of trough in between the fields, and then they began to throw all the stone that they got out of each, the fields on each side into that trough without making any effort to place it or to create a shape with it at all. Eventually, however, those troughs tended to fill up and start to spill over. You might think that they would take them apart and they'd try to build the outside faces up a little bit more coherently, but they didn't do that either. Instead, they stepped out 5 more feet on either side and put 2 more lines of great big huge stones to create 2 smaller but serviceable new troughs, one on each side of the existing mess. My family and I took apart one of these walls in a search for stuff to use on one of our own projects once that had 5 separate outside pairs of containment lines. It was almost 30 feet wide. When you see this phenomenon, that's pretty extreme. Most of them aren't that big. But when you see this on a farm, you can be sure that the farm itself was a going concern for quite some time. It wasn't a flash in the pan, because it would have taken, such and such a number of successful seasons of digging stone out of those fields in order to produce the amount that filled these structures up. This was repeated over and over again in things like ramps running into barns, especially in large retaining walls, which need an enormous backside of of relatively carefully placed stone in order to resist the push from the upper level on the back side of these retaining walls. Because our stone supply is so varied, our walls tend to be varied too, because many sections of the country of the countryside here in New England are characterized more or less by a particular kind of stone, even though other kinds may be mixed in there. Some of these stones break away or wear down in flat plates. Others, which have been in water for a long time, tend to be smoothed over and rounded. There are various combinations of these and other shattered or broken type pieces of stone. And so you can be fooled into thinking that in New England there are many kinds of stone walls. Structurally speaking, however, there's only two. One of them is the freestanding wall, which rises into space and shows what we call faces on both sides. And the other is the retaining wall, which rises into space on only one side and marks the difference between two grades of different height. The principal difference between these two types of walls is the mathematical relationship between width and height. Stone walls must have a certain amount of mass in order to hold themselves together over time. That's really the goal, especially of the old-timers when they build a wall, to hold it together over time. The longer their walls stood and the more they experienced what it's like to be in New England with its climate and its weather patterns and how that impacts stone walls, the better they were able to put walls together that could resist this kind of deterioration. And one of the ways that they did that was to put so much weight into the upper reaches of a particular wall that it was pressing down with enormous pressure on the stones that are in the lower courses, making it very, very much more difficult for them to move around and thus to cause problems as time went on. This is particularly important in retaining walls. But for freestanding work, there's a kind of rough formula which we tend to see in looking at some of the older work that's still standing. It's not something I've ever seen written down, but it's repeated so often in so many older pieces of stone that I've looked at and taken apart that it almost seems like a rule, or perhaps a rule that developed in use over time that was never quite articulated. That mathematical relationship for freestanding walls is about 3/4 to 1. In other words, if you're proposing to build a freestanding wall and say you want it to be 6 feet high, you need to start with a footprint, that is the part of the wall that is standing on the ground, that's touching the ground, of at least 4 feet, 3/4 of that 6-foot height, or else the wall itself as a whole will not have enough mass to hold itself together in an optimal way throughout its life. For retaining walls, the other kind of stone wall, that formula is even more strict. It begins at 1 to 1 and goes up from there. This is particularly evident in things like foundations, which of course are built to hold up buildings and are far more difficult to repair if they develop trouble. In fact, in foundation work, especially of the 19th and early 19th and throughout the 18th century, we often see some of the most careful and frankly beautiful of the old-time stonework because they took extra care with foundations. It is considerably more difficult to repair a stone wall that is holding up a 40 by 60 barn, for instance, than it is to repair a field wall that's out in open space. So that relationship between width to height begins at 1 to 1, but is often exceeded by that. My family and I restored an old foundation under what had been a 2-story carriage house some years ago. This foundation had 8-foot tall walls. Let's pretend this is the cellar side in its basement. Behind those walls, we found more than 12 feet of carefully laid stone running back into the hillside. 12 feet, that's 1 to 1.5. It's an enormous amount of stone. But they did not build the back sides, the hidden sides, the hillside sides, straight up, as you would have with a retaining wall. they stepped them up in a kind of rough triangle to about an 18-inch cap, which is where the sill of the building sat. This creates an enormous reverse dam, and it makes it impossible for the settling fill on the high side to push that wall over. This is one of the few old-time tricks that hasn't been copied very carefully by modern-day builders. And so if you've ever seen a retaining wall, tall or short, which is leaning out away from its bank, and sometimes you can even see them go down because of this. You are looking at a retaining wall in which the backside mass, that invisible reverse dam triangle, was inadequately built. It's not heavy enough to resist the push from behind. Well, as you can see, there's an awful lot to say about this particular subject, and so while not shutting up, what I'm going to do now is ask you what it is you'd really like to know. Yes, sir, right here.
How did the farmers dig the stones out of the earth? Like, did they have, box helping them? How did they transport the stones to the wall?
Yeah. Right. This is a question about moving heavy weights. We know that these farmers moved ungodly weights, gigantic stones, and managed to somehow put them in all kinds of places, whether on the other side of the farm or 6 feet up in a foundation someplace. Well, they had numerous tricks, and as you pointed out, they had power. They had a power source in the form of teams, oxen, and then horses later, and so they had considerable pull at their disposal, although perhaps not as convenient as a Kubota with a diesel engine in it, but nonetheless pretty strong. If you've ever seen pulling contests at a county fair, you know that these animals are capable of moving something that's pretty darn heavy. But the real answer to this question is a bunch of single words: ropes, ramps, rollers, all kinds of things. And I'm going to give you an example or two of this. But I'll start by saying, when I started to learn to do this, my uncle was very fond of saying to me, if you can move it an inch, you can move it a mile. This isn't news that a 22-year-old kid really wants to hear, but it is the truth of how they, or the beginning of the truth about how they were able to move unbelievable weights in productive ways. They were task-oriented. We're production-oriented today. If we can't get a thing done within the budget or the time frame we think it ought to be done in, then we either convince ourselves we didn't really want it in the first place, or we call somebody else with a bigger hammer. They didn't have either one of these luxuries, and so they had to make do with what they could manage. And it is true that if you can move a stone at all, you can take it wherever you want it to go. If you can move it an inch, you can move it a mile. What's the difference? The difference is you have to be willing to move it a mile an inch at a time. That's the only difference between them and us, but it's also the reason they were able to accomplish what they were able to accomplish. To get a giant stone out of a hole, which is basically the first part of your question, you have to enlarge the hole so that you can get to the underside of the stone, first of all. One of their favorite tricks when they had to dispose of an enormous boulder in the middle of a field, but not move it anywhere, was to dig the hole around and beside it to the point where they could dig it deeper than where the stone was itself, and then gradually undermine the stone until it fell into the new hole and went down below the surface of the ground. As you can imagine, this takes a long time, but that's one way they got rid of huge stones. If you want to take it out of the hole, then you have to create on the side of the hole that you're digging down underneath it a kind of low ramp. If you can do that and you can get all the way around this great big stone so that you are now beginning to cut in under it, then you give yourself a place to pull it from, to get a chain or a rope around it so that you're team can drag it up the incline of the ramp that you've made. If that doesn't work, but you can raise one end of the stone, then you're golden. Let's pretend for a minute that this tiny little piece of stone is actually 10 feet long and a foot and a half wide. I could personally take that stone home to my house in Hopkinton, New Hampshire, with a simple, smaller stone and the magic wand of stone wall building, the 6-foot iron bar. These bars generate enormous pressure at their tips. And so if I can get, using the little stone as a fulcrum, if I can get one end of this stone off the ground, right, then I can put something else underneath there. How about a 4-foot length of round pole that I cut conveniently for this purpose prior to my little work session? If I do that, then one end of the stone is now on a roller. Do the same thing on the other end, and now it's in the air and it's on rollers. If I attach a chain to that, off we go. All I do is pick these little skids up each time the stone passes over them and move them to the front. I'm creating an instant rolling road for the stone that I'm going to use. When I get it to the project, maybe I'm building a barn foundation and the stone I want to place is 3-4 feet off the ground. Do I lift it off the cellar floor? Nope. One thing you have to remember about these giant stones we see that where your first reaction is nobody could lift that, is to go, yeah, you're right. Nobody can lift it. And so they don't even bother. The stone never leaves the ground on its way to its new destination. If you can get one end of it up, if you can get it to move, then you can transport it. When you get to your project, if it's a foundation and it's a retaining wall foundation, well, of course, they're not going to try to lift the stone off the cellar floor. They're going to drag it to the high side and roll it down into place that way. If that's not possible or the wall is freestanding, they wouldn't hesitate to build temporary ramps at one place or other on the stone wall in order to move that stone up and into place. One of their favorite tricks with freestanding work was to put a ramp on one side of their project, put the team on the other side, put up a temporary ramp, bring the giant stone to the base of that ramp, throw the traces over the wall, and attach what's known as a rolling hitch to the stone itself. A rolling hitch is a way of tying a rope or attaching a chain to a stone so that when the team pulls on it, it doesn't drag, it flips over front ways. That way it could be rolled up the ramp. 3 guys with 6-foot iron bars sometimes don't even need a team to do that. 3 guys with iron bars and know what they're doing can make a 2-ton stone do a little dance if they want to, just by the graduated application of leverage and a kind of rhythm. Needless to say, they got pretty good at this. And those are only some of the reasons why they were able to move enormous weights. But you're all aware that human beings have been moving ungodly weights and ungodly sized things, especially chunks of stone, for thousands of years with no mechanical assistance whatsoever. Another trick they had was to leave one end of the project down at ground level so that the entire project becomes a kind of ramp in and of itself. Stones that are sitting on other stones are far easier to move because the contact points are so few. You'll find that if you put a 1-ton stone on top of 3 80-pound stones, a little kid can practically move that stone with an iron bar then, because there's no drag, there's no friction whatsoever as there is on the ground. This also accounts for the fact that many of these farmers waited till the winter in order to move the heaviest weights they had to move, certainly in the form of logs, but also in the form of stones too, and that's because the tracks they were dragging on froze. This reduced the amount of drag that anything you were pulling along tended to create. They discovered some years ago that this is how the Chinese built the enormous walls of the Forbidden City, out of blocks of stone that had been quarried many miles away by creating special winter roads of ice in order to drag them from the quarry to the place where the city was being built. These kinds of tricks tend to show up when you're all alone out there in the wilderness and you have to do a certain thing, so you get a little bit creative. But again, the main impetus for this is their willingness to spend the amount of time that was necessary in order to get these chores done. It makes it all the more amazing that they were able to accomplish what they did in this countryside in such a tiny little amount of time. Just for perspective, the entire nation of Great Britain, where they have been building dry-laid stonework for upwards of 10,000 years, has in it only about 70,000 miles of stone wall. Here in New England, we built more than 3 times that amount in a tiny fraction of the time. About 8 generations of New England farmers and others created what we have here. And what we have here has been reduced, much reduced, by time and development now. And yet it's still a dominant aspect of the New England countryside, something virtually everyone who visits here has to mention almost right from the first. We're so used to looking at these walls that we hardly see them sometimes. But that's not true of people who come here who have not seen what is here. It's become ever more important as a cultural marker of the countryside. Okay. What else can I tell you? Yes, sir.
Can you talk about the use of local stone, such as the baldies and the glacial stuff that's in a lot of places in New England, versus people wanting a higher level of craft and importing stone from flat rocks from Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere? When did that all start?
Well, the question is kinds of stone and how they show up in particular walls. The questioner points out that a lot of our stone, as I've been talking about too, is not very copacetic when it comes to building stone walls, and yet other kinds of stone from other parts of the country have become popular too. It's been popular for some time, for instance, to import a type of stone called Corinthian out of upstate New York. Now that's not really out of the New England, the northeastern United States area, but it is a kind of stone that's not visually familiar, as familiar to others. It's lighter, it has big broad veins, and it's pretty obvious what it is, kind of cream colored, unlike a lot of New England stone. Another very popular type of stone for landscape building purposes has been, in the last 20 years or so, a type called Pennsylvania flat. As you might imagine, it comes from Pennsylvania. It is ossified mud that has been sucked back down into the earth at some point and cooked into stone in the mantle and then pushed back up by tectonic collisions. What's fun about Pennsylvania flat is not only that it's all like this, but also that because it's mud from former sea bottoms, it's often full of fossils of shells, other marine life. So they cut this out of the mountains in Pennsylvania, and because it's flat and plate-like, it's very easy to build with. So folks have taken a shine to that too. There are also parts of New England in which much of the stone supply is also flat and broken. Parts of Connecticut and Rhode Island are full of slate-type stone that's very characteristic of individual areas, although they have other kinds too. And so the stone walls all appear to be made of broken dinner plates. That's true in parts of Vermont as well. People now purchase stone from other parts of the country because of the design of particular landscape schemes, and because we can transport things now so much easier than we used to be able to. As far as using the terrible old shapes and the great mess This is something that is important to people who do restoration work like myself, or who want to imitate the older styles in which builders had taught themselves ways to use bad stone, mostly by overbuilding, by creating cradles within the structure for rounded ones, by doing something called battering, which is to let the sides, the vertical sides of a stone wall, come in as they come up and not come in, not go up straight. This allows you to set the center of gravity of each succeeding layer a little bit further in so that they tend not to roll off each other as time goes by. So the use of unuseful stone has an importance to those who are after a kind of historical veracity with respect to how stone has been used here in New England. Those who don't care about that, or who want another kind of look, don't hesitate to buy other kinds of stone from other places, and many people who build stone walls have trained themselves to be able to use that type of stone as well. So it's really a sort of at this point, it's strictly an aesthetic choice, I think. Yes?
You mentioned that stone walls were built to keep sheep in.
Yeah.
How tall of a stone wall does it need to keep a sheep in? Because if a sheep is like a goat, you think it would climb right over top.
Many of them can, yeah. Some breeds don't climb well, others do. The question is, what does it take in a stone wall to keep a sheep in? And you obviously know something about sheep. Well, yeah, goats are a little bit more nimble, but it's the same story. Well, this is one reason why you want a livestock wall to be vertical, for instance, so there's no incline. One of the things that's surprising, even to people who live here and who are quite familiar with our old stone walls, is their original dimensions. In the state of Connecticut, for instance, there was a state law at one time that mandated a 4.5 to 5 foot height off the ground for livestock containing stone walls. And this is particularly important for sheep. Sheep will attempt to get out of any place where they can see over the barrier. They are grass is greener animals. And so if they are standing on their hind legs, but they can't get their eyeballs to go over the top of a stone wall, for them, the other side doesn't exist. And so they're not even going to try. This is why especially our sheep walls were commonly 4 to 5 feet high. If they had to be augmented with poles or other materials, so be it, but many of them were simply built to that height. They're not that height now in so many places because of ordinary deterioration. And stone walls that have been abandoned deteriorate in 2 ways. Certainly from the top, with toppling from all the little things and others too that I mentioned over time. So perhaps a 5-foot stone wall loses 1.5 feet just to that. And there's some other gaps and so forth that develop over time. But out in reforested areas, stone walls lose considerable height from the bottom as well. And that's because when the forest comes back, all of a sudden you get that annual rain of not only leaves, but sticks and pods and everything else that falls off the trees. And as it blows around on the ground, the stone walls do what snow fences do. They collect it. You may have noticed, and I bet you will now, when you're walking in the woods sometimes, if you see you're on fairly level ground, but when it approaches a stone wall, it begins to rise just a little as it approaches the stone wall. That little hump, if you will, on either side of an old stone wall in a reforested spot not only has in it the stones that toppled off the ground, but also 1 or 2 feet of rotting forest floor from all those years of leaf fall and other stuff collecting up against the wall and then rotting down. The old-timers did not tend to build trenches under their walls. They simply built flat to the ground. And so if you scrape away the forest duff away from the sides of some of those walls, you're going to see 2 or perhaps even more courses of stone, layers of stone, that appear to have been interred in the ground before the wall was built, but that's not true. Generally speaking, they were laid onto the grade that existed at the time of their construction. And yet the grade has risen against them over time, sometimes to the tune of a foot or 2. So if you lose 2 feet from the bottom and a foot and a half or so from the top, you can see how a 5-foot wall becomes a 3-foot wall pretty quick. Yes?
As far as I know, it's a standard on how much a wall should cost. What brings how do you know where you're picking a wall to make a wall?
This is a question about estimating cost for having stone walls built. I think things are settling down a little bit that way. I also think that pricing of the construction of stone walls is still a little bit like the Wild West. I mean, there's in trade crafts like plumbing or electricity, things have more or less settled down to an expectable level of pricing. If you look around a little, you'll see that estimates don't vary that much. That's not true yet of stonework. It is, if you're going to contract to have something built out of stone, it really behooves you to get 2, 3, or even more estimates, because you'll be astounded at how different they are from each other. Some people who do this think that they can, and maybe they can, use a one-size-fits-all estimate structure in order to tell people how much a particular wall is going to cost. We've never been able to quite do that, and that is because the circumstances of a wall being built are so variable. You need to know where that stone is coming from. You need to know what it is your customer wants to see in terms of its style or its look, whether they like older, rougher, antique-looking stuff, or finely fitted and very flat, modern-looking stuff. One of the things that I've found tremendously helpful in that regard is this book, which is really mostly pictures. It was put together about 10 years ago by a guy from Maine, and what it has for the purposes of thinking about having stone walls built is it's got beautiful photographs of pretty much every single style these walls can take, from the tightest, ultra-modern looking one to the roughest, use every stone type one. It has, I've got it out, so I'm going to change the subject slightly here. This has one picture in it that will leave no doubt in your mind how it was that we got 250,000 miles of dry laid stone wall. I know you can't see it from where you are, but I'm going to leave it open for anyone who wants to look at it. It's an aerial photograph of a little section of ruined farmland in upstate New York, where the old medieval pattern of 1 and 2 and 3 acre fields is still perfectly visible in the down through the leafless trees on this patch of ground, all in beautiful little colonial squares and rectangles. Look at that photograph and you'll be amazed. We only ended up with 250,000 miles, because this is exactly what the huge amounts of the New England landscape, of the northeastern landscape, looked like when it was first laid out for farming. But to answer your question, the only solution to this, because transport is always different, because the source of the stone is always different, because how much preparation you've got to do to the site, it matters whether it's on recent fill or some other kind of subsoil. It matters what that subsoil is, whether it's sandy and soft or full of stones and clay and glacial till, that kind of thing. Without knowing any of those things, I don't see how you can possibly arrive at a per completed foot price, unless you have a pretty good idea of what the details are of what's going to happen. So the only solution, I think, for potential customers here is to collect estimates until you've got several of them, and do not just bite the first one that comes along. Yes, sir. Yes?
Is there ever encountering unique drainage or water delivery
The first part of the question, did I ever see?
Drainage features like a stone-lined trough or anything of that nature to divert water from a retaining wall?
Well, it's pretty hard to divert water away from a retaining wall because the retaining wall itself is nothing but cracks. It lets through anything that tries to collect up behind it. You would want, in some situations, to put in what are called weeps, which are short sections of pipe that are laid to emerge from the front face of the wall, but they run back into the hillside a little bit to collect water that may be forming back there. But since dry laid stone retaining walls don't collect anything, all water passes. They are themselves drainage situations. I think that the only water diversion things I've ever seen in older work are usually the attempt to shore up the banks of streams or to fortify a curving part of the stream so it doesn't keep eroding, or in some places where there are flash floods to line the base of the ditch with stone in order to keep it from eroding too much during those storms. So there's a little bit of that. Farmers, however, tended to roll with the punches in terms of water. This is true, of course, of foundations as well. One of the worst things you can do with an old dry laid stone foundation is point it up. In other words, fill all the spaces between stones with mortar, because that immediately starts to let water on the outside collect. These foundations were meant to admit water. I grew up in an old farmhouse that was built in the very early part of the 19th century, which had such a foundation. And we were simply accustomed to having 2 feet of water in that cellar for a couple of weeks every spring. It's just what happened. That's not as acceptable nowadays because we have filled up our cellars with electronics and other expensive machinery that doesn't like to be in water. When the only thing down cellar was grandma's pickles and canned tomatoes on a shelf 5 feet off the floor, it didn't matter. That foundation would admit water and pass it just as easily. So I think that was probably the philosophy there. Yeah.
You described the importation of stone from other places that's used in modern stone construction in some instances. If one wanted to build a wall that was representative of what was called traditional New England stone, for example, are there sources of those kinds of stones for construction other than digging them out of the ground yourself?
Well, you can always do that if you want to kill yourself and really experience this from a historical perspective. No, there are lots and lots of people who are dealing in stone now, and they will be very glad to sell you palletized types of everything from general weathered New England field stone from right here at home to dozens of other kinds and colors and textures of stone, and you will pay a pretty penny for it. One of the difficulties we've had here in recent years is that weathered New England field stone has become quite valued as a building commodity, not just here in New England, but in other parts of the country as well. And so there's a theft problem which has developed over time. You only need to see what people are getting for this stuff in order to know why that is happening. If you are going to buy a ton or so or two of nice weathered New England field stone that's been put on pallets, you're going to pay somewhere between $300 and $800 a ton for that. What's a ton of New England stone? Imagine this table, half its length, built square from the floor to the top of the table. That's about a ton. On a volume basis, it's not much. Our primary type of stone isn't granite, although many people think it is. It's a metamorphic type called schist. But we got plenty of granite. Granite weighs 165 pounds a cubic foot. How much of that is a ton? Not much. So we're talking about real money here. Some of these guys will pull up next to an old stone wall on a country road in a dump truck, pulling a trailer with a bucket loader on it, and just go to work. Unloading the roadside stone wall, putting it in the bucket, dumping it in the truck, and then driving away. People don't tend to ask questions when heavy equipment is on a site. They assume it's legitimate. This is how we're losing lots of stone walls out in the countryside. They take it back to their ungodly lair, put it into a semi, and send it down to Florida, where they make scads of money selling it to people to put up as veneer for their fireplaces and so on and so forth.
Do you have any statistics on the loss? I mean, you said we had all of this, thousands and thousands of stone wall feet. How much have we lost? Anybody?
Right. The question is, how much have we lost in the context of how much the USDA discovered that they thought we had in 1871? I have no idea. I really don't. First of all, the USDA number isn't correct anyway. What it mostly is indicative of an enormous size. And I can also say that the proportion of cleared to forested land in New England is about the reverse of what it was in, say, 1810, which is to say, at that point, something like 85% of the entire land surface of New England was cleared flat. It really looked like England around here. It did not look anything like what we have now. If you could see that landscape again, you'd be astounded at how far you can see from any high area across enormous amounts of land. So no, I can't satisfy you with that. We've certainly lost a great deal, but we also still have a great deal, and we're getting more now than we used to. Yeah, right here.
Yeah, I would suggest that other towns do what Lowell does. I was having my stone walls repaired, and I got a call from a police officer and in the town, and he had the person who was doing the repair in custody and wanted to make sure that he was working for me, and it really ticked off the guy who was doing the repair. Very well, but I thought it was pretty good that they were up on top of things.
So you're telling me that the one of your finest picked up a guy who was working on a wall and basically accused him of stealing it? You know, I've been around talking about this subject for 20 years. That is the first time I have ever heard of a local enforcement official caring enough to even find out if that was a legitimate activity. Yeah, I bet he was. Well, I feel badly for him, but at the same time, to know that kind of awareness is abroad, at least in some places, is reassuring in a way. I think that people are far more aware now of the heritage value of our old landscape than they were even when I was a younger man. And that can really only be a good thing. Yeah, one more? We're going to get kicked out of here. I got one more right here.
So suppose it was like the year 1850 and Mr. Smith went out with his two sons to build a stone wall. How long do you think it would take him to build like 100 feet of stone wall?
100 feet? Well, it depends on what kind of stone wall you're talking about, too. Something that's 4 or 5 feet wide and 4 or 5 feet high, that's going to occupy him for a while. He's not going to work on it full time. One of the things that's amazing about how much stonework we have is that stonework doesn't have a season. It's not like cutting hay, what has to happen at a certain time, or slaughtering, which has to happen at a certain time, or the harvest, or anything like that. It's an in-between. It's what you do when nothing else is more pressing. Now, if he's building something that's double-faced, that he wants to look nice, that's going to show at the road so that the public sees it, that's one thing. It takes longer. If he's building what we call a single stack, which is a form of freestanding wall that's only one stone thick, he can probably build that 100 feet in a matter of a couple of weeks. It's that fast. This is one of the reasons we have this style here in New England, by the way. Why on earth, in a place where one of your objectives is to use up as much stone as possible, would you build in a style that's only one stone thick, that's just balanced, right? This is what Frost's wall and Mending Wall is. It's a single stack wall. It's only one, it's just one stone, all stacked up in a single wall. This type of wall appears to have gotten its start at the beginning of the sheep industry boom. And the reason for it is pretty easy. It's speed. You can put up dozens of feet of this in a very, very short amount of time. And so it became a preferred style for that purpose, and also for purposes where the wall had more symbolic than agricultural value, such as a boundary wall or something along those lines. So if he's building a single stack, he's going to get that done in a really short time. He's building something a little fancier, a little thicker, uses more stone, uses stone of lesser or smaller sizes. It all has to be fitted very carefully. Well, that's a little bit longer. But these jobs don't tend to get done all at once. They tend to get done by degrees as time goes on. So it's hard to put your finger on exactly how long it takes, and how long does it take on any given farm. You know, the labor forces on these farms are quite different from what we think. We tend to assume that they're mom and pop operations, right? There's a father and a mother, and there's some kids. But an 18th century New England farm had a lot more people on it than that. It had unmarried relatives. It had indentured servants in some parts of the region. There were slaves, either African ones or Native American ones, or people serving time for various offenses who were assigned court-ordered labor. This is how a lot of the walls down in Little Compton and Tiverton and other South Rhode Island towns got themselves built by the cooperation, willing or not, of Native Americans who were exceptionally skillful wall builders. So it's kind of hard to put your finger on that. Yes?
Was there a lot of evidence of Native American wall building before the English arrived?
No, not before they arrived.
I've heard people say that.
Well, if you don't ever run grazing animals, I defy you to tell me why you would want to build any type of continuous wall. What is it actually that you are walling in or walling out, to use Frost's construction? Native Americans did build things out of stone, but they tended to be symbolic things or practical things for other purposes. The Abenaki, for instance, used stone constructions in the middle of their villages occasionally as a kind of community communication. If it was built in a certain way, then the tribe was at war, and if it was built in another way, they weren't. They also built stone structures for seasonal food storage in places like Pisgah, the state park in western New Hampshire. They would put up little cone-like or triangular constructions of dry-laid stone to fill with dried beans or other agricultural things, or smoked meat, that kind of stuff, when they went off, because they had seasonal settlements, right? They would stay in one place for a particular season, then maybe go north for a while for hunting and fishing season. So they would create these little food storage places where animals couldn't get in out of stone. By and large, however, they were simply adept at working with natural materials, and it didn't take very long for them to master the idea of a stone barrier or fence once the white people indicated that's what they wanted. I've also heard, although I have not seen this, of a structure in the town of Wakefield, New Hampshire, which is quite ingenious. It is a causeway across a small lake, built by Native Americans, so they say, in order to connect two ends of a trail that was commonly used by the tribes in those days, so that they didn't have to walk all the way around the lake. They could just go straight across this causeway. connecting the two ends of the trail. The brilliance of this construction is that it's invisible. It doesn't break the surface of the lake. It crosses the lake about a foot shy of the surface. You can't use it unless you know it's there. Isn't that great? The other thing about it that I just love is that it doesn't divide the lake ecologically. Anything that lives on one side that's in the water can just as easily get to the other side as it could before the causeway was there. It has a kind of brilliance to it that I just really appreciate. Heather wants us to go. So I just want to say to all of you, thank you so much for coming, giving up your Sunday. It's just been a great pleasure to talk to you. Don't hesitate, you can come up and look at my mess. Check out some of the books if you're interested in reading more. But I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and thanks again for coming.